NBA fans may not be intrigued by the All-Star game the way things have played out in recent years, but that doesn't take away from the significance of being named an All-Star starter. Just this Thursday, the NBA announced the starters for the 2025 All-Star game, and while some people may disagree on who got the nod, all 10 players are levels above the list we're about to go through. While there's always a couple of great players every year, sometimes due to lack of talent in the league or one conference being much stronger at a certain position than the other, we end up with a decent NBA player being given a great recognition. Here are the top 10 least deserving NBA All-Star starters of the last 50 years. Before we get into the list, I'd like to say none of these guys are bad players. All of them had at least one successful year in the NBA, some even had Hall of Fame careers, they just didn't quite measure up in the specific year we're talking about. Just outside the top 10, getting an honorable mention, we have Andrew Wiggins in the 2021-2022 season. This is the most recent example on the list, and if you look at Wiggins' stats, only averaging around 17 points per game, there were definitely a few guys that were more deserving than him. The reason I didn't have him inside the top 10 was a few months later, he helped lead the Warriors to a championship, being the second best player on that championship team. Number 10, Kevin Garnett in the 2012-2013 season. So KG is the best guy we're going to talk about in this video, and it felt even disrespectful putting him in the list titled undeserving. But in the 2012-2013 season, KG wasn't the same guy he was in his prime. He still averaged about 15 and 8 a game, but this was 9 years removed from his MVP season and 5 years removed from his title-winning season in Boston. This was also the Eastern Conference in the 2010s, which has been well documented as being a lot weaker than the West in those days. Another thing to factor in, the next year, KG ended up on the Nets, only averaging 6 points per game. Number 9, Grant Hill in the 2004-2005 season. So as mentioned with KG, Grant Hill was a great player back in his prime. In the 90s with the Pistons, he was consistently a top 10 player in the league. But once he got to the Magic, he dealt with a lot of injuries and was never the same player he was in Detroit. The 04-05 season was probably his best year with Orlando, where he averaged 19 points per game, but the Magic didn't even make the playoffs this year, finishing 36 and 46. Number 8, Anthony Mason in the 2000-2001 season. So Anthony Mason had a solid career, winning a 6th Man of the Year award in 1995 and making a 3rd team All-NBA in 1997. But he only made one All-Star team, and that was in his sole year with the Miami Heat. A 250-pound big body power forward that liked to play in the paint, Mason's the kind of player that we don't see that much of in 2025. He was by no means a scrub, just a guy that reflected a high-quality starter player rather than an all-star. In that one All-Star appearance in 2001, Mason played 20 minutes, went 0 for 3 from the floor with 0 points, and finished with 4 rebounds. Number 7, Steve Francis in the 2003-2004 season. So the early 2000s was some of the first basketball that I remembered, and I always thought of Steve Francis as being one of the best point guards in the league during this time. He started 3 straight All-Star games for the Western Conference between 2002 and 2004, but that last year was definitely his weakest year statistically. You do have to keep in mind the era he was playing in, where rules were much more favorable to the defense than they are today, but Francis' stats that year were basically 16 points and 6 assists a game, but he was playing 40 minutes a night, shooting 40% from the floor and averaging almost 4 turnovers a game. So not exactly an efficient stat line for Steve Francis in an era where there weren't a lot of great point guards. Number 6, Dan Majerle in the 1994-1995 season. Now I know this is said about every player that could shoot a little bit that played before 2010, but just watching his highlights, you couldn't help but think that Dan Majerle would have been so much better if he played today rather than playing in the 90s. A very good complementary player in his time due to his 3-point shooting and defense, Majerle was lucky enough to play with guys like Charles Barkley and Kevin Johnson. The crazy thing about Majerle starting for the West this year was he wasn't even a starter the full season for the Phoenix Suns, coming off the bench 36 of the 82 games. Majerle ended up with one of the starting guard spots over guys like Gary Payton and Mitch Richmond. Number 5, Brian Winters in the 1975-1976 season. The 70s have a reputation as one of the worst decades in NBA history. But if you look at the starting lineups of the All-Star teams these years, you'll see a bunch of Hall of Famers and just great players. Brian Winters does stand out as a little bit of an outlier in this regard. Winters was a smart basketball player and a good shooter for his era. He ended up making 2 All-Star teams in his time in Milwaukee, but considering the fact he was the best player that the Bucks got back in that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar trade, I think they would still consider it somewhat of a disappointment. Number 4, AC Green in 1989-1990. So you probably know 3 things about AC Green. He was a great role player on those Lakers teams in the late 80s. He only missed 3 games in his entire career and has the longest active streak of games played in a row in NBA history. And the fact that he liked to talk about abstinence and waiting until marriage to have sex. What's often not talked about AC is that in his only All-Star appearance, he was a starter with the West, starting alongside guys like Hakeem, Magic, Worthy, and Stockton. Now there's no question he was a great role player on one of the greatest dynasties in NBA history, and he definitely deserves some recognition for this. But naming him All-Star starter was probably going a little bit too far. Number 3, Antonio Davis in the 2000-2001 season. So this is our second starter from the East All-Stars team in 2001. In this game, the West started Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and Chris Webber as their big men, while the East started Anthony Mason and Antonio Davis. How could that possibly happen? Well, the East had a bunch of big guys hurt this year. Theo Ratliff, Dikembe Mutombo, and Alonzo Mourning all missed the All-Star game due to injury, which allowed not only Davis to attend, but end up starting for the East. Sometimes a slew of injuries can lead to a solid starting center like Davis getting a superstar-like honor. Number 2, Lonnie Shelton in the 1981-1982 season. So Lonnie Shelton fits our definition of a good, solid basketball player, but not a great player deserving an honor like this. Shelton had one of the best seasons of his career in the 82 season, averaging around 15 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists a game. A few years earlier, he had helped the Sonics win the title in 1979 as a solid role player in that team, one of the least talked about finals teams in NBA history. Although not one of the players we remember from the 70s and 80s, Lonnie was always talked about highly by his teammates and the opponents he played against. But because of his position as a forward, Shelton got to start that All-Star game over guys like Magic Johnson, Moses Malone, Bernard King, and Alex English. Number 1, BJ Armstrong during the 1993-1994 season. So you probably recognize BJ Armstrong as the backup point guard for those first 2 Bulls titles, and then he was the starter in the 1993 season. Well, after Jordan left to go play baseball, Armstrong had an opportunity to be a more focal point in the Bulls' offense, and he capitalized in the 93-94 season, averaging around 15 points, 4 assists a game. Now you wouldn't typically think this is an all-star stat line, but you gotta keep in mind the era and factor in that Armstrong was insanely efficient throughout the season. Along with Scottie Pippen and those other members of the 94 Bulls, he helped them win 55 games this year and stay afloat without the greatest player of all time. Like Shelton, Armstrong was able to capitalize based off the position he played and the conference he was in. The East was hurting for guards, especially with Jordan gone, while the West had guys like Clyde Drexler, Mitch Richmond, John Stockton, Gary Payton, and Kevin Johnson. You could still make the argument that either Mark Price, John Starks, or Mookie Blaylock should have got the start over Armstrong. Unfortunately for BJ, the 94 All-Star game would be his only appearance, and a couple years later he would find himself back in that backup point guard role, playing with Golden State, Charlotte, Orlando, and one last season in Chicago. That's the list. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.